Thank you for making the time with WJZ. You have been mayor now for nearly 2 years. So the first question is, as your position as mayor, what has surprised you about this city? And alternatively, what keeps you up at night?
Well, nothing surprised me. I've been married for 2 years, but I've lived in Baltimore for all 38, going on 39 years of my life, and spent over the last 15, going on 16 years working here in City Hall. What keeps me up at night is that we still are a city that has this disease of violence that we are trying to cure ourselves on, but also becoming a city and becoming a mayor during the time of the pandemic, right? When you add the traditional Baltimore issues on top of a worldwide pandemic, that's a lot. But the loss of life, people's lives being threatened, people struggling in ways that they didn't before the pandemic show up. When you think about the economics, folks who are now, losing their jobs and maybe losing their homes. All of those things that impact the lives of people, but nothing keeps me up at night more than people dying on our streets.
I want to turn to some of the issues. One of the issues, as you very well know, that WJZ has covered extensively is the issue of squeegee workers. Should the city of Baltimore have squeegee workers?
Well, I think that when you ask about a question around whether we should have squeegee workers or not, I really always put that question back, is that should any American city, the wealthiest country in the history of the world, have people who are living in situations of poverty that they have to do that? Whether it's a squeegee worker, whether it's someone homeless standing on a sign, whether it's a squeegee man in New York, whether it's a water boy in Atlanta, all the cities are dealing with this very similar issue because it's really resolves around poverty. And the answer is no, but the answer is also more complicated than folks are letting it out to be. We know that squeegeeing has existed in Baltimore for at least 40 years, so that's, if you're counting, that's 2 years longer than I've existed, but we're talking about this in a vacuum, and this doesn't exist in a vacuum. And what we're doing now through this Squeegee Collaborative, where I'm hearing from the business community, the philanthropic community, the actual residents that are impacted, people that used to squeegee, young people that squeegee, law enforcement, everyone together, so that they feel like this is the first time that this is not an issue that we're treating for a moment, but thinking about how do we actually work to start to solve a very complicated issue, that we're not just moving a problem away, that we're working to do it in every way, which means accountability for everybody. Motorists, people who squeegee, who violate laws and hurt and harm people. Everybody that has a responsibility in this is at that table, and that's what the collaborative in the very near future will be bringing back to me, the framework for how we should move forward as a city.
You have said in this collaborative, quote, "We must find ways for these young people away from soliciting funds on our corners." What does that mean? Does that mean an end to squeegee workers as we know it? If so, when, and what is the timeline for this?
So I think that anyone would be foolish to think that they're going to end poverty or end poverty force work, rather just saying yes, right? This is about how do we start to provide those solutions from the top to the bottom that prevent these young people from going out there, that address accountability in every way, so that we're seeing fewer and fewer and fewer, so that we're talking about a city, right? A city that it doesn't matter where you come from, that you don't have to be involved in those situations. Because while many people are thinking about this just about squeegeeing, right? We still have folks who are standing out there asking for money, begging for money with signs, right? Those kind of things exist. We're talking about a poverty and social economic issue, and in Baltimore, we would be foolish to not think about that through the lens of this city being the first city to weaponize redlining and the racial things that have happened in Baltimore's history, the structural racism that we're still trying to undo today. Anybody that wants to make this issue that simple is simply asking Baltimore to go back to things that we know didn't work in the past, and that is criminalizing being black in Baltimore, no matter what you're doing, if you're doing something right or wrong. We're working to resolve this issue, and we know that there are things in the short term that we're going to have to do, intermediate and long term, as we're building a city where we don't have that kind of poverty in the first place.
Like what?
Like everything, right? And it's different. Every single individual, and we continue, the Mayor's Office of African American Male Engagement, the Mayor's Office of Children and Family Success, partnering with businesses and other folks around the city, continue to do that work even while the collaborative is going on. Every issue is different for every young person. If you're a 13, 14-year-old who literally is out there because if you don't bring money home, then your younger siblings don't eat. That's a very deep issue, right? And that's not something that you can just say, give that person a job, because that young person should be in school. So you have to work with not just them, but their family. You have to get them in the right place. Services are different and needed for different folks. There's mental health, behavioral health, substance abuse. There's the opportunity, again, this is an economics driven thing, right? The reality is that we have to create job and career opportunities that actually meet the same amount of money that they're getting squeegeeing, right? Because if I can go out there and work and make $200-300 a day squeegeeing, as long as I can do that, I'm not going to take a $14-15 an hour job at McDonald's. I'm just not going to do that because I can make more money. We have to work with our entire community to provide a new ecosystem for the correcting these things, and that's what we're trying to do here.
The collaborative, we're going to see the results in the next week?
In the next few weeks, in the coming weeks, we'll see it.
I'll take it. I'll take it.
We'll push them. They're meeting now multiple times a week because we know that we're trying to get them to work together in a deeper way.
One last thing on that. Incoming City State's Attorney Evan Bates recently said that you two have sort of paused because we know that you have different approaches on how to handle this. Is that the case? Have you put a pause to this with your conversation with Mr. Bates?
Well, I wouldn't call it a pause because Mr. Bates has someone that's involved in the collaborative, and my office is involved in the collaborative. We will continue to work together. I know that not your outlet, there's a certain media outlet that wants to create this division between he and I, but let me say it again, there is no division, and we'll be working with him as he comes aboard to implement on his portion of what's going to be done, knowing that the enforcement portion is solely in our case.
I want to ask you about crime, Mr. Mayor. You have made addressing crime a priority for you, your administration here in Baltimore. For our viewers, what does it mean to establish a community violence intervention ecosystem? And for those folks that I see every single night, what does it mean? What does it look like for them who they say are scared and say that violence, gun violence, is an everyday occurrence in their lives?
It looks like this. We know that Baltimore has been a violent city, again, longer than I've been alive, right? And I was around in 1993 and know what the worst of the worst looks like, right? I will never forget that. That's what pushed me into service, is what I saw as a young child. But I also know, now know that some of the things that happened as a result didn't help Baltimore become safer. It actually made it worse. And we have to really evolve. And what we're talking about here is not going back to the zero tolerance policies where hundreds of thousands of black lives were ruined and families were ruined and people were arrested just because they were black and outside, and folks like myself were sat down in handcuffs in the rain as I was coming home to my neighborhood from St. Mary's College just because they thought I committed a robbery when I was 2 hours away when it happened, right? We can't go back to that.
That happened.
That happened. That happened, and it wasn't the first time I got pulled over, right? If you're a young black person my age that haven't had that experience, didn't have that experience back in the day, you're few and far between.
How many times did that happen to you?
I probably got pulled over about 5 or 6 times in my life. Had that actually happen like twice. So, but you know, you get pulled over, and I was lucky, right? We know what happened to so many people who went to jail over things and all of these kind of things. What we're talking about now is doing and expanding on what we know works, right? Because a lot of folks, they talk about going back to these things that didn't work, right? And when you look at how we can actually impact violence in our city, years and years and years of my time in the community, in city government, I've heard from folks, not only do they believe that we have to have the highest productivity from our police department, operating constitutionally, making sure that we're implementing reforms, but having them go after the people that are actually committing the violence and holding the illegal guns. And we know that these illegal guns are what's driving the violence in our city, right? And when you're talking about the reality that with 500 fewer officers than we had in 2014, we've seized more guns, right, than we did then, you're talking about a more productive police department. But simultaneously, and I'll get back to that, simultaneously, what the community has always asked for is, why doesn't the city invest in us to help create safety in our own community? Because police officers go home, elected officials go home, DPW, everyone else goes home. We have to stay here. Growing this community violence intervention ecosystem is literally that. us investing in community organizations, not just expanding the great work that we do as a city with Safe Streets that has mediated over 1,700 things this year already, which is, even if you do 10% of what they've done, we're talking about saving 170 lives, not just growing the hospital-based intervention system. Now we're going to be working with our hospital-based partners to know that we'll have violence interrupters who are coming and working with those folks who are the victims inside of that, growing how we are doing our victim services to include gunshot victims, which the city of Baltimore never did before. We started to do that recently in the city, but making those direct investments into community organizations that can have that impact. Folks like We Are Us, those brothers are out there working in the neighborhoods, intervening in violence, helping people get connected to jobs and careers, making sure that we're working on reentry before these folks come home from jail, knowing when they're coming back, going behind the wall, working with them now, growing all of these things out to support these organizations so that you have an ecosystem that is helping to attack violence from every way. This is something that Baltimore should have done many, many moons ago, and we know we have to build it up, but we can no longer live in a world, and nor should we ever have lived in a world where we put all of that on our police officers. They have their role, and what we're doing for them is alleviating a lot of the things that they had to do in the past through our call burden reduction program, through our call diversion work that we're now trying to expand so that they can do more great work, like seizing already this year more ghost guns than they did last year, while we also go after those gun traffickers and those manufacturers who are fueling our streets with these violent crime guns.
I want to touch on one thing you brought up, Safe Streets.
Yeah.
Is the Safe Streets program reducing violent crime in this city?
Absolutely. And I think that it's not just about what we say. We've had Safe Streets has been studied by folks like Dr. Webster and other folks and have been actually talked about at a national level as a program that works. But like anything that you do, as you go through time, you have to evolve it. And what we're talking about now, bringing in LifeBridge and Catholic Charities to operate a lot more of those sites, is about how do we expand that work? Because Safe Streets, since its inception, has been in neighborhoods in specific small areas. And we're talking about growing that work too, so it doesn't just represent the impact that they have on such a small portion of the city, but how we evolve and grow that to have a larger impact. But the data speaks for itself, and that data has been verified beyond folks in the city of Baltimore, and we have a lot more work to do.
I want to talk about that data because in your office's review from April 2022, along with an academic study, most recently, there have been multiple, but most recently, October 2020, they say that Safe Street sites with more evidence of harm than benefit. That is just one.
Some sites, not all. I think that's an important thing to talk about. Right?
100%. And I know that you are working on additional evaluation. But how do you justify to residents that this approach is the right one when you have studies like this one? One is too many.
Take it to you like this. For that one that we have, but we also had Bella Edison go without a shooting, right? A whole year, homicide without a whole year with a Safe Street site. We've had Cherry Hill do that multiple times. And anyone that knows that that didn't happen before that program existed. And if we were talking about, we have to understand that, again, this is not something that someone else did. I said that we should do this because I felt like the program had gotten stale and that we had to evolve the work. But this is also about, this is why the leadership of who is operating these programs itself, the community-based organizations, is changing. Because if LifeBridge is having the success in Belvedere and in the places in Woodbourne Arcade where they're working, and we're seeing that other sites are falling off, we would be wise to think about how do we replicate that, right? Because you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? Just because one Baltimore City Police District is up 20-40% in homicides, I'm not just gonna say, oh, we're gonna stop having a police department. We have to understand that we treat Safe Streets the same way, right? We know that the program works, we know that the impact is there, but what we have to do for those places that have not had the success, and the reasons that we found out why the success hasn't been there, has really been about the leadership, the implementation, not the strategy itself. Leadership matters, and that's why you see the changes, and that's why we know the impact will continue to be had as we build up the newer version of the program.
With this new version, how will you measure the efficacy?
Well, the efficacy is there, right? Because we now actually doing that for the first time, monitoring how many incidents that they are in, looking at the data, because listen, the data is going to be driven by the violence in the areas that they operate in. So we'll know that, because when people are getting shot, when people are getting harmed, we'll know if we interacted with those people, but also if people are getting shot and harmed in those areas, we have to understand that the data will drive whether we're being successful or not. And that goes for not just Safe Streets, that goes for BPD and every other agency that we have. We cannot get into this world where we allow folks to say, oh, well, we have to do away with Safe Streets when we've been doing things a certain way in Baltimore for a whole bunch of years. And we have to understand that we tweak things, right? When you had the success early, and if you talk about the report, the early successes that the program had, the successes fell off because folks did not evolve and invest and change with the times, and that's what we're going to be doing now.
What do you tell your residents who say, Mr. Mayor, we are still seeing 300 or more homicides per year, so in my mind, I don't know that I see change or feel it. When will we see 200, if ever?
Well, we're going to work towards that every day, right? But this is what I want the residents of Baltimore to do. I want us to get out of this mindset that is solely on the police department and solely on folks like myself. We have to understand this. If the police department is arresting more people with guns, more people with violent guns, why is it that they're seeing those same people back out on the street? Where along in the other parts of the system do we have to make those corrections? Why is it that we have folks who were sentenced for 10 years for a gun crime in 2020 be sent home in 2 years and then be a victim of a violent crime in the city? When you're talking about public safety in Baltimore, and this is why I am so excited to be having both our incoming state's attorney, Ivan Bates, and Wes Moore come on as governor, because we can actually have partners to work on the other parts of the system. We have allowed ourselves in Baltimore to get brainwashed, essentially thinking that the police department and the mayor and the city are responsible for all public safety, right? Essentially, after the police do their job, it's out of the hands of the city itself. Working on things like this, for example. Why is it that I can be on home monitoring for a carjacking and be outside of where I'm supposed to be for more than 24 hours before any action is done? Maybe that's why we're seeing people who are being shot and killed with an ankle bracelet on, right? How is it that we continue, if I ask the police department, hey, and how many carjacking arrests have you had recently? And then they say 30. How many of them are rearrests? And they say, well, or for similar crimes, they say 20. What is happening when we're talking about the rehabilitation, the accountability on the other side? We have to pay just as much attention to that. I know that we've been communicating and talking with them and excited to onboard those folks and help work on those issues so that what you see, the productivity, which again is higher for the police department than it was recently, result in not them just seeing that person back out in the street in a month, in 2 months, in 6 months, but they actually do the time that they're supposed to, and that there's real rehabilitation happening, that we're not just sitting people in a box for a year or 2 years, that we're working on trying to correct them into a way to get them to a point where they don't return to that life. And that's the kind of work that you see already. We have restarted the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council with this sitting governor, and know that with Wes coming on, with our state's attorney Ivan Bates coming on, that we're going to be having even more partnership to deal with those issues that are systemic and things that should have been handled many, many years ago. The three of us, none of us created them, but it's our job to work together to fix those issues and expanding things that we know work, like our group violence reduction strategy that we're now piloting in the Western District, where we have a over 30% decrease in non-fatal shootings and homicides, expanding that to other parts of the city. But knowing that that is both a carrot and a stick approach. We're literally telling the folks who are most likely in West Baltimore, the Western District, the district that typically drives the violence in Baltimore, that you have a choice. You can take all of these resources that we can give you and your family to change your life, or we're going to come at you with the full weight of local, state, and federal government in partnership, and that's how we are operating. Our partnerships with our federal partners haven't been stronger. Our regional partners have never been stronger, and what we're going to do now is improve those partnerships at the state level with the incoming folks to make sure that right now has been a big, big thing that we have been missing on.
So, Mr. Mayor, do you tell that resident that we speak to who is saying, when will I see that change? Is that when Mr. Moore gets in? Is that when Mr. Bates gets in? Or
No, I
is
say
it next month? Is it
I
next
say they
week?
see the change every day, right? When you come off a month like September, which September was the lowest violence month that we've seen before Freddie Gray, when people know what the police are doing, when they know that they've seized more weapons and made more gun arrests than they did even in 2014, when they see that they're pulling these people off the street and the police department will be communicating that out, that then allows our residents to say, okay, they are doing their job. What has to happen after that, right? What's going on with these people so they're not back out? The changes are happening every day here. We're talking about a police department where we have finally got police redistricting done for the first time in over 60 years to make sure that the resources are adequately distributed across the city. These are systemic things that have been plaguing Baltimore for a long time. But my job was to come in and start to dig into an issue that again existed longer than I have, and to try to push us to a system and systems change that will have the long-lasting impact.
Just last final things, big issue that we have been seeing and covering consistently at WJZ is young youth, teens with gun violence and being found with guns on them. You know, Mr. Mayor, I know you know about the tragic death of Jeremiah Brogdon. I know, 17 years old, first week of school. That raises a serious question regarding guns and violence in schools. Firearms are easy to obtain, as you have said before, difficult to track. What is your plan for addressing guns in and around our city schools?
Well, I guess that gun was never in the school, right? And I think this goes back to my other thing. And you know, I knew Jeremiah personally. And Jeremiah told his mom that he was going to be seeking me out that day to ask me to help him find a job that went along with his football schedule. So it's a really painful thing for me personally. But I think a couple of things here. One, this is why I was the first mayor to create this firearms intelligence unit that is now working directly. They've been assigned directly to work with our U.S. Attorney, Eric Byrne, specifically around guns, right? Going after folks who are using guns, committing gun crimes in school zones, around schools, etc. This is why I'm suing gun companies who are purposely going around rules and regulations to put guns in the hands of people that shouldn't have them, but also why the police department is focused on them. But when you talk about Jeremiah's case, it goes back to what we were just talking about. The police department had arrested this young man, right? That's accused of the crime, right? He had been arrested. He had been convicted of a gun crime, but had not yet been committed. That is something that neither I nor the police department can change, and what we're going to have to work with our state partners on, because Jeremiah would be alive today if the things have happened that should have happened maybe in a faster way. But our focus is always going to be not only on the folks who are carrying those guns, which we're doing obviously with the increase in arrests that we're making on guns and the increase of seizures of guns, but the places that they're coming from, the manufacturers that are producing them, the people that are trafficking them, as we've been making gun trafficking cases, working with our federal partners at ATF and others. That's what we're going to do, as also working with school police who do a great and phenomenal job of catching that stuff when it comes into our schools.
I want to talk about that, the SROs, because they do a phenomenal job. We have covered, they call us and they say, you know, we have identified a loaded gun today at this city school. And you know that quick arrest that happened on the day that Jeremiah was shot and killed happened because, you know, the time of the shooting happened at around school dismissal. The SROs had already gone to their lockers, collected their guns, and therefore they felt safe enough to go after the shooter. Should SROs be armed in schools? Well,
I've said this before. I got in trouble before. For me, when I was at Maryville, our school police officer had a gun, and I never felt like that SRO was a danger to me. And as someone who worked and helped coach in the school, and often had to deal with folks who are coming up to that building trying to fight teachers or fight kids, right? This is about, for me, they should. And this is about protecting. It's not about them using it on students, right? Because we've never seen that even happen in Baltimore. But we know that the folks that in control that made a decision, it's not one that I agree with, but in my opinion, they should have them.
You talk about, you know, this approach of doing a lawsuit to reduce the number of guns, but at the end of the day, and you've said this at press conferences, you know, how do you convince a student not to bring a firearm into a school. How do you teach the city's youth to resolve conflict more peacefully? I know you've said it in your ecosystem, you've got school-based programs, but how do you do this that affects change next month or the next 3?
You got to do it every day, right? Because again, when you're talking about a culture that has existed in Baltimore for decades on decades on decades, right? That work has to be done in the immediate and the long term. There is no either or. That's why putting these programs in place now and in the future, growing them out, is so important. Because think about it like this. If we had that kind of a dedicated violence intervention work in schools when I was there, and it would now been growing to a part of the culture, how different would the city look today, right? That's the truth and the reality. That's why when you're talking about investing in our young people, it's about investing now, yes, so that you start to see those changes immediately, but also starts to grow in the generations to come. It's a both and approach, because anyone that thinks that you're going to show up and be talking to a group of teenagers today and next month, their mindset is going to be totally different, doesn't know anything about teenagers, right? You have to do the deep work, and this is why we call this foundation changing work for the city, because it was not done before. I can't talk about why it wasn't. I can't talk about who didn't and why they didn't do it. But we're starting to do it now because it's so necessary. If it were done before, we wouldn't have to. But we are, and that's the important thing for us to start today, working with the young people that we have today, working on every angle. What you and I have been talking about over the last 15 minutes about us working at every angle to deal with gun violence, right? And just for folks to also understand that around the country, when it comes to CVI and community-based work and dealing with even police reform, Baltimore is seen as a leader, right? We're going to be hosting the Cities United Conference here in Baltimore later this month, where mayors and folks from around the country are going to be coming to learn about work, how to build that work. Much of that is going to be guided by us here in Baltimore, and we're going to continue to work each and every day to reduce violence, but most importantly, to start to change some of those systemic things so that folks understand when my police officers are out there busting their butts each and every day, removing guns, removing violent people off the streets, when my community violence intervention workers are doing the same thing, that it's having the most impact possible.
Just last question, what do you say to the mothers who I speak to who say, I can't let my kids play outside, to the grandmother who can't walk to the bus stop where there was a quadruple shooting there and a woman got shot? What do you tell them? Because I know we are a leader. I know you are making bold decisions and working your butt off. Sorry. But you are. What do you tell them who aren't seeing maybe the change they feel fast enough? How will you win this war on crime and gun violence so that they can see it in their everyday lives?
We're going to win the war because we're not going to give up. And because those are the people that I have to talk to. The hardest conversations are talking to those parents who have lost their son, their daughter, their mother, their grandmother, their grandfather, right? Having to hear that pain, seeing the pain, having to deliver that message, as you heard me say to some of Jeremiah's classmates that day, some of the hardest things that I'll ever have to do in my life. That is what fuels me. That's why I won't give up. We're going to work and attack this with the community. This is not something that we're going to do for. We're going to do this with the community so that everybody in every part of Baltimore feels safe and comfortable being in their own neighborhood.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.